I too struggle with the notion of an afterlife. Any of us who have stood at the grave of a loved one have had to ask the question, now what? The idea of this evening is to try to explore this question honestly, find answers, and ask more questions that are either comforting or disconcerting. So, let's begin. My first question, we decided to forego long opening statements. We're going to make this as conversational and respectful and fast-moving as possible. And my first question is going to go to Rabbi Wolpe. David, do you expect to go to heaven?
Not tomorrow. That's the old joke about, the good news is that there's baseball in heaven. The bad news is you're pitching Thursday. So what I would say is that part of the problem of the idea of an afterlife is that we tend to make it far more literal than it needs to be, and as a result it starts to seem ridiculous. I mean, before you entered this world, could you have imagined mountains and tuna fish and teeth and ideas and music? Of course not. It is literally unimaginable. But we make of the idea of another world something that we can imagine and understand, and so we reduce it to nonsense. It's Mark Twain in Letters from Earth. He said that people assume when they go to heaven they're going to lie on green fields and listen to harp music. He says you wouldn't want to do it for 5 minutes while you're alive, but you think you'll be happy for the rest of eternity doing it after you die. And the crux of it is, and I suspect really what this evening will come down to, is do you believe that human beings are entirely material? Are you only made of stuff? Or is there something non-physical? Is there something ethereal and eternal about you, about us, some mystery at the heart of this stuff? And if there is, then there's a possibility, that we'll all, I don't want to say go somewhere because that assumes that it's spatial. And again, that's the way people think, and the way we think is not necessarily the way the world is. Our minds are much too limited to grasp it. But I'll just close by saying that I always assumed that human beings were more than stuff. And for me, at least, this came home on an emotional level when a little less than 2 years ago, my father died. And as many of you know, it is a Jewish custom when someone's buried to throw dirt on the grave. And I thought this was going to be extraordinarily difficult, to take a shovelful of dirt and throw it on the coffin of somebody that I loved very dearly. But I actually didn't find it nearly as difficult as I anticipated, and the reason is that I knew that whatever was in that coffin, he wasn't there. But I also knew that that wasn't the same thing as he wasn't. It just meant he wasn't there, but he was, and he is. I just don't know how.
Sam, in The End of Faith, you chide scientists who believe that consciousness ends with death. So, picking up a little bit on what David said, you wrote, the place of consciousness in the natural world is very much open to question. The truth is we simply do not know what happens after death. To my mind, this very much leaves the door open for a belief in the afterlife.
Although it doesn't make the traditional beliefs in the afterlife any more plausible. It's not the point I was making there. But it does, that point of not knowing what happens after death is what worries me about this conversation. I've been very worried about this, that all of you have given up a perfectly serviceable Tuesday evening only to hear the four of us tell you every which way that we have no idea what happens after death. I expressed this fear to my wife, and she was actually able to put me at ease. I'm worried, obviously, about boring all of you, and she said, nothing Hitchens does is ever boring. So I have that going for me. Right. I think we should think about what this concept of the afterlife does. We'll talk about the plausible versions of it and how implausible some of the traditional ones are. But I think, just to give some context, we're living in a world in which 9 million children every year die before they reach the age of 5. Okay, year after year after year. I mean, that is an Asian-style tsunami of the sort you remember from 2004 every 10 days. killing only children before the age of 5. I mean, think about these children, think about their parents. Know that virtually all of these parents are people who believe in God and were praying all the while that their children would be safe. And their prayers were not answered. Now, the afterlife comes into the midst of this reality and as a promise that all of this is going to make sense in the end, that somehow at the end of existence we are going to be all let in on the punchline and have a mighty laugh with Almighty God for eternity. Now, there's no evidence of that, and I think, therefore, this concept of the afterlife really functions as a substitute for wisdom. It functions as a substitute for really absorbing our predicament, which is that everyone is going to die. There are circumstances that are just catastrophically unfair. Evil sometimes wins, and injustice sometimes wins. And the only justice we're going to find in the world is the justice we make. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to absorb this really down to the soles of our feet. And this notion of an afterlife, that the happy talk about how it's all going to work out and it's all part of God's plan, is a way of shirking that responsibility. So that's where I am.
Brad, 3 times a day as a religious Jew you would pray the Amidah, where you extol a God who resurrects the dead. It says that right in one of the most standard of Jewish prayers. When you say that, what are you saying? What do you believe you're saying?
So I need to take a couple steps back and make this a running jump rather than a standing jump.
Sure.
As I understand it, rather than simply reducing someone's idea to a caricature, which is easy to do on all sides in this kind of a conversation, we live in an age in which there are different plausible ways of making sense and connecting the dots. One of them is a kind of reductionism in which everything can be explained by its smallest physical components. And once you've explained how inert matter operates, then you create more complex systems, but you've done all your explaining really at the very basic subatomic levels. And that's completely plausible, and you can tell the entire story that way in a reasonable way. I don't think it's the only way one can do it. One can also say that there are intimations all the way down of what others have called, and I think of as mindfulness. And that the mindfulness all the way down emerges at some point into consciousness, which emerges at some point beyond that into something even beyond the consciousness we're aware of. And we have abilities to access it, not necessarily by what we know. And here I have to say, having read the books of the authors here, I agreed with almost everything that everyone wrote. People claim knowledge where they can't possibly know. But what I think we can also claim is intuitions that go beyond what we know. Things like hope and trust and loyalty. We ground our lives in them. So there are people who use the afterlife as a way of evading their responsibility. But I know that I and Rabbi Wolpe have sat at the bedside of people who were able to connect with others because this belief inspired them to live each moment with dignity and connection. So for me, the prayer is literally false. Having lived one life with flat feet and fat thighs, I fervently hope that God does not physically resurrect the dead. Although I will tell you, I'm one of the rabbis dancing in Gadi Levi's dance thing, so I expect to have buns of steel by the time you come back for that. But I think it's a metaphor for saying that there is a oneness of which we are an expression, and that does not cease with our death, and that in some very important way, although not one that is reducible to knowledge, I don't claim to know, but I trust that we continue beyond the grave.
Thanks. Christopher, what's wrong with that? If a belief in the afterlife helps one, as Brad said, deal with the inevitability of death, maybe this is a good thing.
Well, then anything that made you feel better would be okay, which I'm sorry to say I think is a contemptible viewpoint. Here's the problem with the afterlife fantasy. It's the same as religion in general. If you can't hear, I hope it's not my fault. All right, how's that? Okay. Not to duck the opening question, give myself a chance to repeat my answer. That would mean that anything that made you feel good or better was fine, which I think is a contemptible position, I'm sorry to say. And it would be as good as drugs, for example. And I don't believe, and in fact Marx never said, that religion is just an opiate. But religion and the afterlife fantasy have these things in common. First, they're man-made. That's very important. They represent claims by humans to be able to interpret the divine and to give themselves power by doing so. We all admit we don't know. That's because we can't know. So the people who have to leave the island right away are those who say they do, who for centuries have tyrannized and still do millions of human beings by claiming to hold the keys of heaven and hell. Leading to my second point, religion is totalitarian in its practice and its theory. It claims to know things it can't know, and it claims to have powers it cannot have. It says if you make the right propitiations and the right donations, you may get paradise, and if you don't, you may get an eternity of pain. That includes, by the way, the souls of unbaptized children of the millions who Sam mentioned. Then there's, I'm afraid to say, but you also, as you'd expect from the man-made, the argument of fraud. St. Peter's in Rome was built on the sale of indulgences. That's to say, in return for cash, the promise of a remission of sin and of time in hell or purgatory. There are chantries, actually quite beautiful ones, still all over Europe, still working. Prayers being said for the repose and remission of souls. Pope Benedict, the most reactionary prelate for considerable time to lead the church, is trying to restore the idea of remission of sin in exchange for donations or other in-kind operations. This is, I'm sorry if it sounds unduly functionalist, but until we've dealt with these questions, we can't have a serious discussion. Now, there's also, I think, a real problem about anything that's eternal. I should probably close with this. It will happen to all of us that at some point you get tapped on the shoulder and told, not just that the party's over, but slightly worse, the party's going on, but you have to leave. and it's going on without you. That's the reflection, I think, that most upsets people about their demise. All right then, because it might make us feel better, let's pretend the opposite. Instead, you'll get tapped on the shoulder and told, great news, this party's going on forever, and you can't leave. You've got to stay. The boss says so, and he also insists that you have a good time. I've read about David's father, and I had a bad time when my own father passed on, but the father proposed by monotheism is the father who doesn't die, who reassures his children, don't worry, I'll never leave you. You'll never see the end of me. You'll never get the chance to feel sorry. I'm always there. I'm the absolute ultimate in dictatorship, and in my courts there's no appeal. Do you really think that this would cheer up anyone of sentience or humanity or capable of feeling of irony? I submit it's out of the question.
I just want to say I was completely with you until the end when you got silly on us. And the reason I say that is because you speak about God in the same way that you would speak about a human dictator as though they were equivalent.
Much worse.
Much worse. But it's only worse. It's only worse because of the eternity of it, right? But the characteristics are the same.
No, the absolutism of it.